It's easier to say, oh, we're gonna show everybody that we know this league is good with or without Caitlin Clark. We're gonna prove it.
Last season, Indiana's road schedule turned into the league's main attraction. Games were bumped into NBA-sized arenas all over the country because regular venues couldn't handle the demand tied to Caitlin Clark. This year, that pipeline suddenly tightens up. Only 4 Fever Road games get moved into bigger buildings, even while the league as a whole expands arena shifts from 15 to 19.
But once you talk to your owner buddies and they say, look how much we made. I mean, Indiana Fever came to town. Look how much we're making. Right? Once Renee Montgomery and Sheila Johnson talk to the owner of the Las Vegas Aces, talk to the owner of the Chicago Sky, and they say, hey, what was that gate looking like? Oh, damn. That's a lot of money. Indiana had 9 road games moved to larger arenas last year, but just 4 so far for 2026.
That's where the math starts looking funny. The league keeps talking loudly about growth and rising demand, but the decisions feel selective. The public excuse leans on caution. Clark's groin injury last season gets brought up as the safety net explanation, framing smaller venues as responsible planning instead of missed opportunity. But the real-world test already happened. When Clark's availability changed, the crowds didn't vanish. Tickets still sold. Seats were still filled. Those games still proved Indiana was the biggest road draw in the league, with or without her on the floor.
WNBA teams are moving more games to different arenas this upcoming season, but Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever have significantly fewer of those games. The WNBA's regular season schedule announced Wednesday, including 19.
Indiana's road attendance blew past everyone else at roughly 15,184 fans per game. That's about 4,000 more than any other team, and Clark only appeared in 3 of the games that were moved before the injury. So the question isn't whether teams can sell tickets without her, because they already did. The real question is why the one team that consistently delivered the strongest road demand is now getting fewer chances to scale that demand up. Now pull the curtain back a little. These venue decisions don't fall out of the sky. They come from ownership groups, front offices, and league stakeholders who all have opinions about what the WNBA should look like and whose story gets the spotlight.
The Washington Mystics, Connecticut Sun, and Atlanta Dream each moved 1 game against Indiana last year, but none for the upcoming season. The New York Liberty, Portland Fire, Mercury, Valkyries, and Minnesota Lynx are already in NBA arenas, removing any need to move games for bigger crowds. Is part of this due to injuries? Well, they would like you to believe that, I think. They would like you to believe, oh, well, she got injured last year. We don't want to move. We don't want to commit to a bigger arena. God forbid she gets.
Start with Atlanta and Washington. Renee Montgomery sits in the Atlanta Dream ownership group. Sheila Johnson is part owner of the Washington Mystics, and she's also the executive who publicly pushed back when Time magazine highlighted Caitlin Clark, saying recognition should be spread more evenly across the league. Last season, Atlanta moved 1 Indiana game into State Farm Arena. This year, they moved none. Washington followed the same pattern. 1 moved game last year, 0 this year. Connecticut adds another data point that's hard to brush off. The Sun took a Clark game to TD Garden, the one many fans now associate with the injury. This season, there's nothing comparable on the calendar. If the league truly believed Indiana was the safest bet for demand, at least 1 marquee move should still be locked in. Instead, what we see is a quiet pullback.
Names like Renee Montgomery, part owner of the Atlanta Dream. Names like Sheila Johnson, part owner of the Washington Mystics. Sheila Johnson, the same person who threw a fit that Caitlin Clark was named Time Magazine's Woman Athlete of the Year. And she said, why give it to Caitlin Clark? Let's give it to the whole entire league. If you ask me, this is a subtle play from folks like Sheila Johnson and Renee Montgomery. Because at the end of the season, they decreased the amount of Fever games that have been moved to bigger arenas. Yet in totality, they increased the league from 15 games to 19 games.
And this trend doesn't stop with one franchise. Chicago and Dallas each moved 2 Indiana games into larger venues last year. This year, each gets only 1, and they land at nearly the same time. So no, the league hasn't abandoned arena upgrades altogether. Just look at Toronto's expansion team. They have 5 games shifted across multiple venues, including dates in Montreal and Vancouver. That's the league sending a clear message. When it wants attention, it will absolutely rearrange buildings to get it. Stack all the numbers together and the pattern gets louder. Total moved games jumped from 15 to 19, yet fever-related moves dropped sharply from 9 to 4. If this were about logistics or a league-wide pullback, the numbers would flatten across the board. Instead, the strategy expands while narrowing where it applies. Indiana stands alone, moving in the opposite direction. Zoom in on the 4 big venue dates that remain. July 5th against Las Vegas, August 8th against Chicago, August 18th against Toronto, August 20th against Dallas. Every single one lands well after the opening stretch, long past the moment when cameras are loudest and early season buzz is at its peak. Last year, the league leaned hard into early demand, stacking big arena upgrades at the front of the calendar while the spotlight on Caitlin Clark burned brightest. This year, the approach feels different.
4 times this season. You see how massive the season was? You see how much of a success it was this year? And we only had Caitlin Clark. See, we don't really need her. I told you guys we were going to do this without her. Interesting. The decrease in moved fever games comes after Caitlin Clark played in just 13 games last season. Clark appeared in just 3 of the 9 moved road games, including July 15th against the Connecticut Sun at TD Garden. Clark injured her groin in the 4th quarter of that game and missed the remainder of the season. The Fever remained the league's biggest attendance draw last year, averaging 15,880.
It looks like an effort to start the season quietly in smaller buildings. Let the initial frenzy cool off first, then roll out the larger arenas later, once attention needs to be reignited on purpose. And there's another incentive sitting right in front of everyone. The collective bargaining agreement still isn't finalized, and the 2026 season carries real uncertainty around timing. Arena managers hate uncertainty. If you run an NBA building, you'd rather keep prime dates open for guaranteed moneymakers, touring concerts, major shows, events with locked-in sellouts. And that reality might be shaping more of these decisions than the league is willing to say out loud. If the calendar ends up with open space, teams know they can always slide an WNBA date in later. What they don't want is locking in too early, then scrambling with reschedules, refunds, or dead inventory if the season timeline shifts. That's why timing matters just as much as total numbers. It's not just fewer Fever Arena moves, it's that they're pushed deeper into the season, when those dates can be treated like optional inventory instead of must-book centerpieces.
If I'm an owner of an NBA arena, if I'm in charge of selecting what events get put in these arenas, well, without a CBA deal reached, why would I want to start already Xing out dates with potential WNBA games when I can keep those dates open for when a Jonas Brothers come to town, when a Taylor Swift comes to town, when a Luke Bryan or whoever come to town? Why would I start Xing out these dates? I wouldn't. It's not smart. I want to keep those dates open as long as I possibly.
And the precedent already shows how flexible this really is. Look at Chicago. The Sky announced in February 2025 that they were moving their first 2 games against Indiana into the United Center, even though the schedule had been public since December. So the idea that everything is locked at release just isn't real. The biggest venue upgrades usually don't happen at schedule drop. They happen later, once teams see the numbers and realize the original plan undersold demand. That exact pattern played out last year. Atlanta waited until March before shifting its May 22nd matchup with Indiana into State Farm Arena. About a week later, Dallas followed, moving a Fever game into the American Airlines Center. Those weren't master plans, they were corrections. That's why the quote from the Fever side matters so much. When a team spokesperson says they can't speak for other teams, but that opponents can still adjust venues before the season begins, that's basically an open door. The league is quietly admitting the calendar isn't as final as fans think. The subtext is simple. Teams are watching ticket demand and sponsor interest in real time. And once the financial upside gets loud enough, some of them will pivot. But that creates a silent problem for certain ownership groups. There are influential voices who've spent the last year pushing the idea that the WNBA's growth is bigger than any single player, that it was always headed here, and Clark just arrived at the right moment. That framing makes sense on paper. It protects legacy, spreads credit, and avoids turning the league into a one-person headline. But revenue doesn't care about pride or messaging. Owners who hosted Indiana last season saw the difference instantly. Gate receipts jumped, premium seating moved faster, merchandise spiked, local sponsors suddenly wanted in. Those aren't abstract trends, they're line items. Talk to teams like Las Vegas or Chicago, and you won't hear theory. You'll hear business. You'll hear what happens when the Fever come to town and the building suddenly needs more seats than usual. So every time an owner publicly argues the league can't depend on one player, they're also cornering themselves. Because if they don't move that Indiana game into a larger arena, they're choosing to leave money sitting on the floor. And if they do move it, they quietly confirm what the market's been screaming all along. Gate receipts don't lie. Moving a game from a 7,000-seat arena into a 20,000-seat NBA building and selling it out isn't a small upgrade. It reshapes the entire revenue picture. For franchises that have spent years scraping to stay afloat, that jump changes everything. That difference is the gap between survival and actually building something sustainable. And that's why the league's current strategy feels like a tightrope walk. Some owners want to protect the message that the WNBA's rise isn't tied to one name, but every owner still has to answer to budgets, sponsorship targets, and season ticket math when those numbers are staring them down. Ideology gets expensive fast. So what we're seeing looks like a compromise that doubles as a test. Keep the early schedule conservative, call it cautious planning, label it prudence, then watch what happens in the first wave of games. If attendance holds in smaller buildings, leadership gets its talking point. They get to say demand is structural, not individual. The league keeps selling growth as a broad movement. And if attendance dips and money starts slipping away, the pivot is already built in. We've seen how fast teams can announce venue changes late in the cycle. That's the quiet safety valve. The option to restore big arena Indiana dates without ever admitting the experiment didn't work. It's a hedge that protects the narrative, no matter which way the numbers fall. The risk is that last season already answered the question. The demand wasn't fragile at all. Even with Clark missing most of the year, Indiana still pulled the biggest road crowds in the league, and it wasn't close. Those seats were sold, and those arena upgrades made sense long before anyone knew an injury would flip the season. That's what makes the current bet feel unnecessary. The league isn't trying to spark demand from nothing. It's choosing to hold demand back and see if it spreads somewhere else. And that redirection is the real gamble. The bet is that new storylines can carry the early season weight, that the audience Clark brought in is now sticky enough to follow expansion buzz, fresh rivalries, and rising stars without needing Indiana as the weekly engine. That's the theory. And maybe it works. If it does, the league walks away with a wider base and a cleaner growth story. But if it doesn't, the backup plan is obvious. It shows up through late venue announcements that suddenly treat Indiana games like premium inventory again. That's the experiment hiding inside the schedule. Either the league successfully turned curiosity into durable fandom, or it's about to relearn that star gravity still pulls the casual audience. Sustained growth takes more than one breakout year. It also takes a media plan that lines up with how people actually watch sports. That's where the ratings narrative enters the chat. The league and Nielsen leaned hard on record viewership numbers to say momentum is bigger than any single name. On the surface, it sounds convincing, especially in a season where Clark logged only 13 games. That feels like proof of a new baseline. But the load-bearing detail is where those numbers came from. Fever games kept landing at the top of the charts. Even games Clark didn't play still pulled massive audiences. People tuned in hoping she'd return, checking the storyline, or wanting to see how Indiana looked without her. That curiosity didn't disappear just because she wasn't on the floor. This season, with fewer Indiana games placed in premium buildings and prime windows early, the league is about to get a cleaner read on the floor. No insulation, no noise. What happens when the biggest draw isn't positioned as the weekly centerpiece? Are fans watching WNBA basketball across the board, or are they showing up for specific stars, rivalries, and narratives that cut through the clutter? That's the real question. And here's the thing, the outcome can be framed either way, and that's intentional. If ratings hold, the messaging writes itself. The product matured. The league stands on its own. If ratings soften, the explanation shifts fast. CBA uncertainty, timing issues, scheduling complications, external noise, and then the quiet fixes start rolling back in. Late venue changes, better time slots. The same playbook we already saw last year when teams like Washington and Connecticut adjusted Indiana games after the schedule was already public. Right now, there's still open space on the calendar for certain teams. That silence is doing a lot of work. But the real tell comes later, when the season gets closer and front offices line up projected revenue next to last year's results. That's when the language flips. Caution turns into opportunity. Scheduling suddenly becomes flexible. The same obstacles that once sounded permanent magically become solvable once the financial gap is staring everyone in the face. Because in pro sports, narratives matter right up until the ledger disagrees. Owners can honestly believe the league's rise is bigger than any one player. They can mean it. But when the choice is between a 7,000-seat gate and a 20,000-seat gate, the conversation stops being philosophical. It turns operational. Premium seats, suites, sponsorship packages, local partner activations. That's not theory, that's cash. And the difference is too big to ignore for long. That's why public statements from prominent stakeholders only tell half the story. People can critique individual recognition and still understand exactly what a fever date does to demand. They can push a league-first message and still react when one matchup doubles the business upside of a home game. The market already answered whether the Clark-driven surge is real. Attendance patterns, broadcast behavior, the evidence is sitting in plain sight. The only question left is what the league chooses to do with that reality. Does it fully lean in and treat the biggest draw like the biggest draw, or does it ration those moments to protect a broader narrative? Send the next piece when you're ready. Right now, the strategy looks like a careful split decision. The league wants to say growth isn't tied to one player, while still keeping just enough Indiana games in upgraded arenas to grab part of the upside. That middle ground approach doesn't really help anyone. Fans who want a real chance to see Caitlin Clark in person get fewer opportunities. Teams that could cash in by moving games to bigger buildings are told to accept smaller gates early. That's just another way of saying they're being asked to leave money on the table. And in doing that, the league is running a live experiment. That gets risky fast if the numbers soften when the biggest draw isn't consistently placed in the biggest settings. Expansion gives the league a convenient shield. Toronto's rollout with multiple games shifted into alternate venues lets leadership point to geographic growth. They can say the strategy is about reaching new markets, not feeding one storyline. That might be true on the surface, but it dodges the only question that actually matters for the business. Was last season a one-time spike driven by the Clark effect that naturally cools off? Or did she create a durable audience that stays engaged even when she isn't the weekly centerpiece? This season is built to reveal the baseline, and it's also built to be explained away if the baseline isn't flattering, because the messaging exits are already in place. If early attendance and viewership hold, the league will call it validation. Proof the product has stabilized. Proof it no longer needs to lean on one star. If the numbers dip, the explanation shifts instantly. Uncertainty, timing, negotiations, scheduling noise, external factors, and then the quiet adjustments roll in. Midstream venue upgrades, better time slots, bigger buildings. The same moves we saw last year when Indiana games were shifted after the schedule was already public. That's why the late winter window matters so much. Watch February. Watch March. Watch who suddenly finds availability in larger arenas. Watch how fast practicality starts beating principle. Once the gap between last year's receipts and this year's projections gets too loud to spin, the league wants to prove it never needed Clark to begin with, while also keeping her as the emergency lever if things wobble. That contradiction is the entire point. If the experiment starts slipping, the story will be that she simply arrived at the perfect time, that the league is now strong enough to keep climbing no matter how many games she plays. Somewhere in that middle space, the message stays consistent. The product is bigger than the player. It's a confident bet, and there is a version of the future where it's correct, where the league builds a stable audience that doesn't rise and fall on a single name. But there's a cost to running that bet in real time. When you downshift the most reliable draw to prove a broader point, you risk turning what should be the most profitable season into a controlled slowdown. And in pro sports, lessons about pride and narrative don't stay theoretical for long. They show up in financial reports. They show up in sponsorship renewals. They show up in the way owners quietly start making decisions that don't match the league's public messaging. That's why the next wave of venue and scheduling updates will tell the real story. Watch which matchups suddenly get upgraded. Watch which teams magically find space in NBA buildings. Pay attention to how fast early season caution disappears once revenue projections start trailing last year's results. The gap between what's said publicly and what happens behind the scenes will tell you everything. So here's the real ending. Not the one being sold in press statements, but the one the numbers force into the open. The WNBA is attempting something ambitious. It's trying to prove it can stand on its own, that it can maintain record momentum without leaning on one superstar as the weekly centerpiece. If it works, it's stability, it's validation, it's a league with a true baseline audience, not just a moment. But if it doesn't work, there's no speech that can cover the gap between a 7,000-seat gate and a 20,000-seat gate. There's no talking point that replaces premium seats, corporate buy-ins, and the energy that follows the fever into every city. In professional sports, ideology lasts right up until it gets expensive. Then reality takes the mic. And the most revealing part is this. You won't need a press release to know which direction the league is heading. You'll see it in late venue swaps. You'll see it in suddenly available NBA arenas. You'll see it in time slots that quietly get upgraded. Teams don't make those moves to send a message. They make them when they realize the message is costing them. That's why the next few weeks and months matter more than any debate on TV. The schedule will tell you the truth. If early numbers hold, the league will claim victory and call it proof it has arrived. If the numbers dip, watch how fast caution fades and how quickly Indiana becomes premium inventory again. Either way, this season will expose what the league actually believes, not just what it says. And once the results are in, there's no hiding from the conclusion. If you want to stay ahead of the next move before the headlines catch up, follow Courtside Leaks for updates. We track the shifts before they're explained. We've got every angle covered, every leak, every behind-the-scenes twist. If you want the truth behind the WNBA headlines, hit like, subscribe, drop a comment, and stay locked in with Courtside Leaks.